All right. Welcome, everybody. This is David Detomasi, and welcome again to Discussions with Dr. D. Today, we're pretty lucky. Talking about a couple very timely subjects, Canada's ability to get big infrastructure projects built and how it might be improved through public policy. And we'll also talk a little bit about what a career in public policy might be like for someone who might be aspiring to it and to see how they can navigate their career in that direction. Helping us in all of this, of course, is Mr. Drew Fagan, who is a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Very interesting background. Drew has spent 12 years in leadership positions with the Government of Canada and the province of Ontario. In addition to his teaching duties at the Munk, he's a senior public policy advisor at Macmillan Vantage Policy Group. I also understand he spent about 20 years as a journalist in various capacities, so he's written a lot about contemporary events. And I'm really just pleased that you could make some time for us on June 25th, 2025, this afternoon. So thank you so much for being here.
David, thanks for inviting me. And it's great to loop back, particularly with Queen's Commerce and the Smith School,
Yeah.
where
You're a grad, right?
I'm a grad.
Yeah.
I went in a different direction, but I stay in touch with plenty of people at that era. It was the last millennium, by the way, so it goes back a ways. But anyway, yeah.
No,
Thanks, David, for inviting me. Pleasure.
You're welcome. No, when I know that you and I have a link with a student named Noah Lee, and
Yep.
Noah helps me with the development of this, and we talked about the topics we wanted to cover, and the people we would want to have on. Your name jumped to the top of the list.
Well, and Noah's been a great student in first year of the 2-year MPP Masters of Public Policy. So there's somebody else who, did a Queen's Commerce degree and is now thinking about public policy, and he's had a great first year, and we'll wrap it up next year.
All right, so let's, I gave you a very brief overview of your background. How about you give a slightly longer one and maybe a bit more details? You did an undergraduate commerce degree, and then how did you end up doing what you ended up doing?
Well, so I went into commerce, back then, you didn't get as much advice with regard to where you were going to go to school for university. There was kind of an assumption in my circle that we were going to go to university, but where you were going to go, what you were going to take, you were much more on your own. And we were all kind of going into commerce, either Western, Queen's in particular. So a whole bunch of us from high school ended up in Queen's Commerce, and some went into arts. And I enjoyed commerce, actually, in some ways, but I kind of felt by second year, it wasn't necessarily for me. I was much more politically interested, much more interested in the world in terms of international affairs. You were talking about that. But I stuck with it and got my degree, but I did a bunch of other things. And actually, I took 5 years to do the degree quite deliberately because I ended up taking a bunch of politics, a couple of international relations courses. So I had much more of a balanced degree, if you like, although it was a BCom. And in my 5th year, I ran this Queen's Journal as well as editor of the Queen's Journal. So, the journalism bug had already bitten me, and from Queens, I sort of did a few things and traveled for a year or two, and then did a master's degree and ended up at the Globe and Mail. I guess 3 or 4 years after I finished my commerce degree, and spent 20 years at the Globe and Mail. And I did just about everything there. And there's other Queen's Commerce graduates. I think of my friend John Stackhouse, who was the editor of the Queen's Journal about 3, 4 years, maybe even 5 years after me, who was at the Globe and Mail with me for many years. We succeeded each other in various jobs and is now at RBC. So it wasn't all that unusual, but it wasn't the usual path. And I just did about everything at the Globe and Mail. I was Washington correspondent. My last job was Ottawa bureau chief. I ran the editorial page. I was deputy editor of Report on Business, where I brought those business skills to bear a little more. And so I'm 20 years into my career. I'm a little over 20 years from graduating from undergrad. And somebody approached me in government to say, would you be interested in joining the Department of Foreign Affairs? And actually, that was the path I hadn't taken after Queen's Commerce. I interviewed for the diplomatic service. I was well along in the interviews, and I don't know, it didn't feel right. It's very hierarchical, especially back then. And I went traveling and ended up at the Globe and Mail. So I was being given quite inadvertently to this person who asked me an opportunity to take the path not taken, I guess. And I ended up as the head of summitry at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, as it once then helped set up the G20, helped organize the G8, as it then was, meetings. And then I became the head of policy planning, assistant deputy minister for policy planning. I did that for about 3 years and did a whole bunch of stuff. Then most meetings, I was really the only person around the senior management team who hadn't spent their career at the department or in the public service more broadly. So, and that's why I've been that's why I'd been recruited. And so I spent good 5 years, got my French down. And then again, I was recruited to be a deputy minister at Queen's Park, and I took that opportunity. So, I know that statistically, younger students graduating now are more likely, it is true, sometimes it can be overstated, to move between professions, between jobs more often. That's something I guess I did. In my case, I've really had, I suppose, 3 careers, because I spent a bunch of years at Queen's Park in various roles, including Deputy Minister of Infrastructure, helped oversee the Pan Am Games in 2015. And then once, I'd done enough of that, I was lucky enough to do a bunch of consulting, and then a couple of years later get recruited to be a professor at the Munk School here at U of T. So, it's been I'm lucky. I'm lucky, and I love it here. So, thanks for inviting me on. It's great.
Well, that's quite a career. I mean, to be able to cover all those bases, that must make it. When you come to Munk, you must bring a full, rich that history for students about what you can do and what's going on in the world. Pretty valuable,
It's so the courses I teach, and I hope Noah agrees with what you're saying. I'm kidding, but the courses I teach, the Munk School, they have a couple of more typical. There's now an undergraduate program, a more typical masters in various regional studies and things. But the core 2 programs are the Masters of Global Affairs and the Masters of Public Policy. The first a little bit more international, the second a little bit more domestic. And they're really professional finishing schools and not focused exclusively on diplomacy or the public service, but with that as a core. And then, of course, the influence of government, and I hope we have I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about this, is so pervasive, even beyond the core role of government, which can be 35, as much as 40% or more of GDP. So the courses I teach do take that practical approach, both at the MPP and the MGA, based on my career, and give students, I think, a really good sense of how government works and how they can be effective within government, or talking to government for the perspective of the private sector or the third sector.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. The thing you just wanted to talk about, what would, I kind of gave you some points to think about. What is it about the public service sector writ large that you would like students to know that they probably don't? One of them already just said is how big it is, but there's some other things, just why is it that this is important for them to know about, and what is it that they need to know?
Well, so the point that I make at the end of both my courses, the core courses that I teach, and I say it too, I've started doing this the last few years, is change is hard. And if they have a bias, it's not necessarily to the left or to the right. And, most students, they're young and they tend to lean a little more left than right. Their big bias is the expectation that change is easier than it is. And so, the role that you play in the public service as well. And some of my students go into the political level and are senior advisors to ministers, prime minister in a few cases, premier. The role you play as a public servant, of course, is to provide apolitical advice to political players. There is a role for facts and veracity and speaking truth to power. And sometimes that can be difficult as a deputy minister. Sometimes it was difficult when you're telling your minister or the premier or the prime minister what he or she really doesn't want to hear. But that's your job. And for the most part, they respect it. But the big challenge, I think, is that the system is sticky and change is hard for a whole bunch of reasons, which is not a reason not to go into, that career. And you don't have to do it for 40 years, but it is challenging, which is an important point to make right now, I think, at a time when the country and governments within the country are facing what's being described as a hinge moment in terms of our relations on the continent with the United States, and the degree to which we have to rotate in a variety of ways. And I'm not sure how much we really do have to, but that's open to debate in order to get things done faster, and what we do to do that and make change, responsible change, a little bit easier.
Well, that's been topic one in the headlines recently about the notion of infrastructure development. Bill C-5 recently was passed, which does a couple of things. Tries to lower federal barriers to interprovincial trade, but also is designed to build things faster. And the image that Canada carried for the last 10 years, I know this from the external business community, is we talked a lot but never got anything done. The regulations were too heavy, the consultation was too slow, nothing stuck, and as a result, very little big things got done. And now we're trying to fix that. Now, that's all what the public sort of perception is of all of this. I'm just kind of curious from your view, is that really true? Are we really too slow? And can our current federal government fix that quickly and easily?
Yeah. So our system is complex. It's a big country, sea to sea to sea, with big regional identities that are structured such that they're fundamental to government. Our provinces are as powerful as any subnational government really in the world in terms of taxation power and in terms of regulatory authority. So one reason why it's hard to build those big projects is because the federal government has traditionally been less than willing to sort of put their foot down, as in some cases is allowed under the Constitution, for fear of political backlash in various regions, particularly the West. And the infighting between provincial governments and federal governments that goes back decades with regard to what the priority should be. You saw this over the last 10 years, particularly with regard to oil and gas / climate change. But you saw that same thing 40 years ago with not just the younger Trudeau, but the older Trudeau, for those of us old enough to remember the National Energy Policy program in the early 1980s. Are there things that can be done? Yes. And I think Bill C-5 will help to do that by prioritizing a little bit better in consultations with the provinces which level of government is taking primary responsibility, allowing the other order of government to get out of the way a little bit, and prioritizing within, not just between the orders of government, within each of those governments, particularly at the federal level, which department is actually going to be leading, because sometimes, frankly, it's not clear.
Well, that was gonna, you've had some experience,
Yeah.
having a deputy minister. I mean, if your minister said, I wanted to do something and I wanted it done fast, what were the things that got in the way? Why is it that it seems so hard to get? That's the image people have of bureaucracy is, and what is that real? And what is the things that, and how do you get around it?
Yeah. So, it varies by project. I do want to emphasize when it comes to infrastructure, of course, one of the things, one of the main reasons why projects often go over, and this isn't just sort of, examples that we can all think of, over in terms of time or in terms of money or under in terms of scope. There's an old joke, time, money, scope. You can be on target for 2 out of 3, but not 3 out of 3, right? Choose
Yeah.
which ones you want. Well, one of the reasons is because there's not enough preparation up front.
Okay.
And so if a minister, and of course, the minister doesn't always have the final say so, cabinet can. In some cases, that's deferred to deputies in certain cases as well, because the government of the day wants to ensure that politics plays less of a role than for a variety of reasons. It's fundamental that you plan well. And I think that, when you cut corners on that, and I, give all sorts of examples, you actually do yourself more harm. But there's a bunch of factors why things are more expensive and take longer. I live in the city of Toronto, the GTA, where the Eglinton LRT has taken substantially longer and cost more. Part of that is systems friction. And the lack of clarity between which order of government is responsible among 3, not just 2, because the feds have paid up, put substantial amounts of money in, and they expect, certain results from that. The province has played the lead role through the agency responsible for transit delivery, known as Metrolinx. But the City of Toronto, through the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, is going to be operating that. So you've had this tremendous amount of systems friction, as well as other unfortunate incidents. Once you dig down, you actually often don't really know what you're going to find, because the records aren't always accurate. So there's a whole bunch of things can go wrong. So planning up front is fundamental, which may lean against this desire to act fast. We have to act faster, but we want to make sure that we need to make sure that we get that balance right as a country.
Yeah, and I was reading enough public policy work. I mean, one of the arguments that leads to caution is the nature of the public sector. I mean, in the private sector, you take risks, you get, money comes in and stock options and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
In public sector, it seems to be a bit risk averse, particularly in the era of social media. You can't get your minister into trouble.
That's
So
right.
that, or you can't let something bad happen. So the idea is somehow, at least the perception, that it's a risk averse because of this inherent risk that people have of being portrayed negatively if something goes wrong, even if they couldn't have foreseen it or prevented it.
Yeah. So, so one method of trying to reduce the risk, with mixed results, is to create agencies that have a more arm's length relationship to the government of day, and kind of let them do their business. The challenge with that, as you point out, David, is, in the end, if something really goes wrong, or it's just a one-day headline, it still falls back on the minister and the government, particularly if it's a project or an area that's particularly controversial, in which the government really has lost credibility over a period of time. So, and the other aspect, yes, government is more risk averse than the private sector generally, but there are circumstances in which the government can take big risks and are successful. I could cite those, both Canada and elsewhere, particularly with regard to seed capital in areas like the internet and digital generally, in which they seeded this for the private sector. And there are examples in the private sector where a risk aversion is substantial. And
Oh, sure.
the banks, as an example, operate in many ways, kind of like, and
Yeah.
especially in this country, kind of like bureaucracies. But the risk aversion goes back to the fact, I think, that government is a monopoly. And, we take the public's money and they expect in return for it to be well utilized, and everybody has an ownership stake. You don't have if you don't buy stock, you don't have an ownership stake in companies. So everybody's kind of an owner, and it's watched more carefully, and social media is more active, and all those kind of things. And leaning against that, and the public services role in kind of trying to get up and over and encouraging government to get up and over those 4-year election cycles, and think a little bit more long term. An old saying about the public services: they're permanent custodians of permanent problems, and they're guardians of the long term. Up against a government that, governments that classically operate and have to operate by our system in 4-year cycles, or less if it's a minority government. So in a good situation, you've got a strong dynamic there, push and pull. Others, governments that are more risk averse, more kind of watching the internet too closely in terms of what people are saying, it's more challenging.
Yeah, I was going to come back to that in a minute or two about communicating over the media. But before we get to that, I would, we have to talk about this one big factor that seems to be pushing the Canadian government, and that is Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
And his, his stated threats of 51st statism, we don't need Canada, ripping up free trade agreements. I mean, he's really exposed a lot of weaknesses in a relationship that I think a lot of us thought would always be fine. And now he is, but how much of an impact is he really? He will at some point probably leave, and then will we go back to being what we were before? How do you gauge what he really has done in terms of what we're doing in this country?
Yeah. So think back, David, 40 years to the start of the free trade negotiations with the United States. When we think about Canadian interest, primarily we think about domestic political unity, societal unity, given the country's history, and we think about relations with the United States, at least in the, throughout the 20th century into the 21st century, as the hyperpower. We made a choice in 1985 to pursue free trade negotiations with the United States, which upended over 100 years of history in which we had, kind of moved away from that, deferred that, avoided that, for a bunch of reasons, including protectionism in the United States back then. And the idea was to do a big deal and again get kind of protect ourselves and get up and over in a context in which, given the size of the U.S. market, Canada could not be as wealthy as it is without, secure access to that market. But we always knew, and the term that people remember from the Royal Commission that essentially launched those negotiations was leap of faith. We knew it would be a leap of faith because the economics spoke one language, but the politics, there was a risk that it spoke a different language, given the imbalance in power. It's a symbiotic relationship, but it's a hugely asymmetrical relationship. We're not a small market economy. We're the 9th biggest economy in the world, with the same size as Brazil. It's roughly the same size as Brazil, Russia, Spain. We're a big economy, which is small compared to the United States, less than 10% the size. So you get a president like Donald Trump who really thinks solely, and he talks about this, solely in terms of the American interest, and is a natural protectionist and always has been going back to the 1980s, which is unusual because free trade was riding high, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the rise of China, with mistakes made with that. And so we were somewhat at risk with regard to that. At the same time, we need to maintain our access to the US market. And I think that's what the Prime Minister and those around him, including our ambassador to Washington, are focused on right now, in trying to get past that in terms of market access for the products we've always traded, as well as market access in other areas like critical minerals, energy broadly, thinking more in terms of our development of the North. And so there is, I think, something of an opportunity there. But at the same time, David, as you point out, there's no question that something has changed in the psyche to say, we need to rebalance a little bit more. We need to reach out in a serious way and be successful with regard to other economies. We can have deeper integration with the United States economically, even into the future potentially, as well as better integration with fast rising Asia or our friends in Europe. And we've talked about that for many decades and not successfully done it. And I think what the Prime Minister is saying now is we have to do it.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that I say in my own classes that reflect exactly that. One is you mentioned earlier the banks, it's pretty cozy. I mean, they lend in Canada, but we aren't out there in the world as much as we probably need to be cultivating international business because it's so convenient, perhaps, to sell to this great big vacuum to the south of us. And the second thing I'd like to talk, I've titled my students, is Mr. Trump, although he is extreme in how he does things, he's tapped into some stuff that's very powerful in the American psyche, including protectionism, including nativism. It's not as if he's the last time we're going to get someone like that to deal with.
Yeah, the United States works in cycles. You think about the Depression and Roosevelt and the New Deal in 1932 into 1933. That era of bigger government, lasted until Reagan. And then the era of Reagan and, warm-hearted conservatism, maybe more in retrospect than it was perceived by, others at the time, lasted by and large until Trump. Because let's remember when, Clinton, won power for the Democrats in 1992, he was not a big government Democrat. In fact, he kind of admitted partway through his administration that government, he wouldn't have said like Reagan did, government was the problem, but he did say the era of good big government was over. And in the eyes of a big percentage of the American population, and to some extent this is felt in Canada, the era of big government was over for them. The working class, they were not being protected, including from competition from China, and the rise of China and the sort of workplace for the world, the factory for the world. So protection was over for them, but protection was not over for Wall Street. Protection was not over for the wealthy, and not just the 1%, but the 0.1%. And that's what's risen. That's what's allowed this populism, I think, is generally accepted to take hold. It's just unfortunate, one, that this has happened. There's plenty of mistakes for that, both in terms of economic policy and geopolitical policy, but to be fighting with Canada, to be fighting with other allies right now with regard to trade policy, there is an opportunity for the three countries, or particularly the two countries, Canada and the United States. They're so symbiotic to be working together for better competitiveness, better productivity. And I'm hoping that The negotiations now underway quietly lead to something like that, even as we work towards closer relations with Asia and particularly with Europe.
So you think there will be a momentum from the Trump shock to allow us to do the things we should have been doing, probably, or will it die out with him?
Well, so I think you're right that the populism of the United States, the anger of the working class of those who've been left behind, is not going to end with Donald Trump. Whether Canada can manage its relationship with the United States throughout this period, it's going to be more challenging. There's no question about that. But I don't think they want to rip up the free trade agreement. I think they realize, the senior cabinet members, members of the administration, that the relationship with Canada can be more of a plus. There is kind of a political challenge to that, given the rhetoric of the last few months. But hopefully we're going to be able to get to a deal. As for doing the things we should have been doing, the United States is a challenging market. It's super competitive. You were saying, our economy is a little too tight. Yes, that's true. It's a little too tight in part because costs can be high because it's a big geographic area to cover. We tend to be more protectionist in terms of ownership and operations in Canada because of what's perceived as the threat of American competition. Think about banking, think about airlines, think about all sorts of sectors.
Telecoms.
Absolutely, telecoms, top of the list. And as a result, many of those companies, banking's done okay in the United States, but telecoms, have they expanded internationally? No. By and large, and other sectors as well. So if you look at Canadian companies, the Canadian private sector, globally, who are the companies that are actually cutting edge now? Shopify, a handful of others, not very many. And that's a challenge for us, including in terms of our productivity and our standard of living, which has been slipping vis-a-vis other countries for a few decades now.
Yeah. So I was just, because we touched on it earlier, I'd like you to go back to your journalism hat.
Yeah.
A little bit. How do you you work for 20 years as Globe and Mail, the preeminent, at least one of them, Canadian news outlet. But now, you see traditional journalism outlets being attacked all over the place as being, not reputable, and I'd prefer to get it my own place, my own way. Now that's a very broad topic of media management for a government or for private sector, indeed anybody. But what do you see is happening in that world right now?
It's a tragedy to me, but it's also a bit of a dichotomy. It's I get up in the morning. I have access to the best journalism in the world at my fingertips. When I was foreign editor of the Globe and Mail, we had 8 or 9, maybe 10 foreign correspondents, stringers who we'd hire for a story or two at a time, and I was kind of, helping to run that shop. It's not like we had the New York Times, in front of me at 8 o'clock in the morning, might come in mid-afternoon. Now I can read it at 7 a.m. I can read The Guardian. I can read regional news. It's a feast. And if I look at the quality of this journalism, it's remarkable. Considering the way various means of sort of accessing information, it's technology based, it's extraordinary. Where there's a desert is in terms of municipal reporting, where the economics just don't work anymore. Think about, every big city, thinking of the English speaking world or just North America had, a good newspaper. The Edmonton Journal, the Calgary Herald, rhyme them off, right? And those are all just a shadow of what they were. And even newspapers like the Globe and Mail, national circulation, doing reasonably well online. I don't get the newspaper every morning. I look at the newspaper as it's printed online and then check in during the day. The economics for a country like Canada are challenging. So it's only a handful of big players. Even the Washington Post is having, financial challenges. So it's just a handful. It's a feast from them. It's a famine compared to what we had. And the Globe and Mail, it's there's a lot of good reporting in it, but the size of the newspaper used to be 3 times as big if 25 years ago, 30 years ago. The volume of news isn't there anymore, and the size of the newsroom's smaller because of the economics. And there's so much misinformation now, or disinformation, and that's really challenging. And you see it in all areas of public policy, and particularly those in which there's kind of ideological divisions between right and left, and those who can monetize the anger. It used to be that within reason, politics wasn't an identity for most people. It was a way of thinking. Now, it's much more of an identity, particularly in the United States, and to a certain extent here. That's problematic. It's hard to have conversations. The word conversation, now there's basically arguments, if that, and sort of given velocity by the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. So I think it's really challenging and makes politics and public policy all the more difficult as well.
Have we been able to resist that trend in Canada a little bit more? I mean, I think it's still a bit there, but I think it's on the fringe, but I just don't have a full sense of it.
Yeah, to a certain extent, although you saw a lot of, challenging circumstances during COVID, including misinformation with regard to the efficacy of vaccines. Science is not perfect. Science evolves. Right. But and I think, a lot of this is honestly felt by citizens. There's no question about that. But there, at the same time, there's all sorts of players. The US market's bigger than Canada, so many, many, many more players who are trying to monetize that misinformation by getting people's taking advantage of people's worst nature or creating it. My apologies. And the other thing is, if you look statistically, and I have a friend who spends a lot of time working at this, look at the number of publications, particularly municipal publications. The death rate of municipal publications in Canada has been close to that in the United States. It used to be that everybody would read the local newspaper. It would have challenges and biases, but it was there and it tried to be accurate, tried to be all-encompassing within reason. Now they don't even exist. So how do you keep track of what's going on at City Hall?
Yeah.
Let alone get deeper information on it. It's a terrible problem because you just can't count on the internet.
And I just thought of this. I call it the ability to monetize mistakes. The expectation that a government agency will get it right 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Or a science will have the result and know it 100%. People stumble, they make mistakes, the world's not perfect, but their tolerance for that in an ideologically split world seems very low. You just find reasons, and there's plenty of them, why the other side is an idiot or made a mistake. And well, yeah, but they did 90 things right, but one thing, I'm seeing that a lot. It's just the tolerance is very low.
Yeah. And again, it's less so in Canada, less so, I think, by and large in Europe. The United States, because of its history, because of, there threads within American history that, the famous book written in 1960s by Richard Hofstadter on, I think, on, the paranoid sensibility of American politics bouncing off McCarthyism in the 1950s, which didn't come out of nowhere either, or the isolationist sensibility of the 1930s before Pearl Harbor. So there's a history there, but we're all there's a risk there for everybody, I think, and Canada's always been more moderate, in part because there was a recognition that, on the cold side of North America, with the population we have, we got to hang together a little bit more. So we'll see.
Yeah, I have a pet theory. I think Canadians are nicer because of the weather.
Yeah.
And I mean that because there's not, if you don't get along with your neighbor, there's nobody else there to help you in the middle of winter. I don't know.
Well, imagine there's we talked about the settlement of the West without recognizing the indigenous aspect of it, 120, 130 years ago, recognizing it properly, of course. But the last best West, and many of those settlers came from Europe, and many came from America as well, and came up. And the winters, on the prairies, when you were, in your own hut, you counted on your neighbors much more than you had to, south of the border. So I think there's something to that.
Okay, I mean, the last set of questions area I want to get into is again, we talked about this in the preamble, is that most of this, a lot of the viewers of this are going to be young people who are in my either commerce or MBAs, youngish, and maybe they want to do something like what you've done or get into this field a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about what a young student should be thinking about in terms of how they might do that and why they might find it interesting?
Yeah, so public policy, look, I don't want to discourage anybody from going into the private sector. If you compare, the quality of government services in Canada, believe it or not, on a global basis, to, in some ways, the competitiveness of the private sector in Canada and the way we've been slipping for the last 3 decades or more, I'd make the argument the first might be more globally competitive than the second. Maybe that's a low standard all around. But anyway, public policy matters. First of all, it's 40% of GDP, roughly, right? And it's fundamental at a time when we're more and more concerned about inequality to begin with, in ensuring that we have a healthy societal structure and mentality and results. And, Canada tries to find a balance between the heavy hand of government that's been a tradition in much of Europe. In France, for example, the public sector is close to 50% of GDP. We're in the low 40s. But public policy matters, both at a societal basis and in terms of economic development. And it changes over time. Compare the sort of sensibility of the Trudeau government to the Carney government in terms of the different balance between, and it's not zero sum, between economic robustness and societal robustness. And that comes to a sizable extent from smart public policy. Not just that, but to a sizable extent, smart public policy. So thinking about that, and hopefully in the years to come, being more entrepreneurial about that. And I think, this government at the federal level will push that hard if we're going to do big projects. Again, after a few decades where it's been felt reasonably that we couldn't, we're going to have to take more chances in the public service, work more closely with the private sector, including developing bigger companies domestically, leaning on international companies where appropriate. And so I wouldn't discourage anybody from going into the private sector at all. But I think it's worth looking at the public sector and its importance, a little more closely than maybe a lot of students, especially at the Smith School or in commerce. That's why they're might do.
Well, I think that's part of the image of the public sector versus the reality. I think what you've just talked about, and is kind of exciting, is the reason to do public sector stuff is that you can do something. You can actually make a difference and create something new. You're not just someone moving papers around. You're actually creating new policies, new ideas that might make the country better, might make it richer. And that's fun. Like the opportunity to do interesting work was always a draw. Remember these ideas that you talked about earlier. The free trade agreement came out of the bureaucracy, the idea of it.
That's right.
And good ideas. So that's an exciting part.
And everybody who was somebody in the federal public service in the mid to late 1980s was working on the free trade agreement, right? Working with the prime minister, Brian Mulroney, working with the trade minister, finance minister, the chief negotiator, Simon Reisman, everybody. And even, 40 years later, many of those people are, they're all retired now, or just about, a couple are still working. Fundamental. I'll give you one example that I did that was tangible, and that is why did Toronto host the Pan Am Games 10 years ago? It was actually an sporting infrastructure play. We had analyzed government, City of Toronto, the province, municipal governments around the region that we'd fallen badly behind in terms of sporting infrastructure. And we bid for the Pan Am Games by and large as a hook to develop that. And there were critics who said, well, we should only do the Olympics. The problem with the Olympics is you overbuild. And the cost overruns of the Olympics are extraordinary. Pan Am, by and large, built community infrastructure that is continuing to be used. So I was the deputy minister responsible for the games. So $2.5 billion came in on budget, came in on time. We didn't have any choice but to come in on time.
And the games are coming.
Yeah, the games are coming. You can't put them off, a year. The 10th anniversary is July 10th. So when we're recording this in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a bit of a reunion. But, so there's something tangible. And if you go out to, the various facilities, you'll see that they're really, really, really well used, including in parts of the city that in socio-political terms are challenged and are big pluses. So I look at that and think there's something tangible that, had an impact.
Yeah, you can point to something that you had a hand in doing that mattered.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
As you can in the private sector. But I think it's had a bit, significant sociological benefit to those communities. And of course, the infrastructure was spread around the GTA to some extent for political reasons. Let's face it, everybody wants some pie, but it's working well. And so you can do big things, and those games were as big as the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. Summer games tend to be much bigger than winter games. It's had a positive effect. Now you're under pressure. I joke that I didn't sleep a full night the year before the games as we tried to ramp up to be ready. So you can have an impact. Now, it also doesn't mean that as the private sector, the public sector, and the third sector increasingly need to work together, it doesn't mean that we go into government or the public service, you're going to do it and nothing but for 30 years. We need more frisson between those three sectors. We need people from business to come into government with that entrepreneurial mentality. We need people from the public sector to both stay in the public sector and go to the private sector in various ways, or to the third sector. But I'd encourage people to think about all those.
How do they do that? Like, what do they need to do to be able to move among those spheres? This is kind of my last sort of question is, you've been able to successfully do that. What's been the key to if you wanted to have a varied career like that, how do you make that happen?
I think it does come a little bit more naturally to students today. Certainly the leaders of the public sector or more conscious of this. Look at the Prime Minister. He's talking about bringing in a handful of, leaders from the business sector or outside government generally to help him move forward. I think the same mentality is evident in the business sector at all as well, and recognizing the importance of companies thinking in not just profit and loss, and that's their fundamental responsibility, but in terms of doing well by doing good to some extent as well. So I think, and the third sector, of course, has grown tremendously over the last couple of generations, and you really see organizations having a big impact, and in some cases actually delivering programs, not just lobbying, but to sort of for resources, but delivering programs, working hand in hand with government. So you see those, the three of them working more closely together. I think that is already happening. And students, these days, I think they have to be a little bit more on their toes than they were. I think of 40 years ago, it might have been a little bit easier. It didn't seem like it at the time. And the students today are smart. I mean, the ones at the Munk School, handful of whom every year come from the Smith School. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. Not only are they dedicated, but they're smart.
The only thing I would add is I would like them to have a bit more confidence that they can, they're very anxious right now, I find, young people, for lots of reasons. I think that if we're able to get the economy going again and you can see some opportunities, I think that'll dissipate a little bit. But it's okay to take a little bit of a risk here and there.
Well, it's a hard year to be graduating this year statistically. Right across the board, harder than it's been the last couple of years. And before that, of course, we had COVID. And for students graduating from undergrad or grad school, of course, that was challenging. There's no question about that. And add to that, of course, the uncertainty globally, whether it's, the impacts of AI, the unknown of that, or climate change, or, this return to the jungle, if you like, with regard to geopolitics, a return to sort of great power competition. And, to a greater extent, the lack of rules might makes right. And where that's going, adds up to, it's not surprising that there's an anxiousness. It's unfortunately based on reality.
Yeah, and it's amplified by this wonderful thing called the cell phone that sticks in, is just feeds it to you. So I worry a bit about that, but I also have some optimism that when the students like Noah, who we talked about earlier, decide they want to take a direction, it's amazing what they can do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's just so much noise. I guess, I felt there was back in the day too. But there's just so much noise in your phone all the time, right? And statistically, there is some truth to it. We don't have the same kind of, length of concentration that we had. Put it in a drawer a little bit, to sort of discipline yourself to take a look at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, the scroll of doom and all that stuff. I mean, most of it is, most of it's just noise, and try to factor it out. And I think by and large, the students we're talking about, the graduates we're talking about and speaking to through your classes and my classes, I think they get that.
Okay. Do you have anything? Have we hit all the major bells that we kind of wanted to?
I think so, David. It's really been a delight for me to have the opportunity with Noah and with you and with Smith and all that kind of stuff. So thank you for asking.
Well, thank you for taking the time. And this is David Detomasi, Discussions with Dr. D, wrapping up with Drew Fagan. Thank you very much for your time today.